All right, well, welcome everybody. Thank you for joining us this evening for the first webinar in our May Land Managers Talks and Workshop series. Today and the next webinar, so May is our native grazing month. So we've got Lynn Gilmore, who is a retired Quail Forever coordinating grazing lands biologist from Missouri, is going to be our presenter today, and he's got some great topics that he's going to discuss for our first native grazing webinar. As you can see on the screen, I have listed out the dates and times for all of these webinars, and I also just want to mention that we do have some field tour portions that are going to go along with these webinars. We've got one in North Arkansas. That's going to be at Mr. Sid Lawrence's farm in Searcy County in Marshall. That's going to be on Thursday, May 26th. And then in kind of the west central part of the state, we're going to have one at the Boonville Plant Material Center. That's going to be Wednesday, the 25th from 9 to 12. We should be getting those registration links for those events put together by the end of this week and sent out. So make sure you follow us on Facebook or send one of us an email. We can make sure to get you that registration link if you're interested in any of that. A couple of housekeeping things before I let Lynn take over. The first thing is this webinar is being recorded and it will be uploaded to our Quail Forever in Arkansas YouTube page. So if for any reason you get disconnected or if you have to jump off early, this video will be uploaded hopefully by tomorrow. So feel free to get on there and catch up on what you missed. You can also view all the other webinars that we've done since January as part of this series, everything from forest management to just general wildlife habitat in Arkansas. And the second thing is that we will have a question and answer section at the end of the presentation. So feel free to type any questions as they come up into the chat box, and we will answer those in the order that we get them at the end of the presentation. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Mr. Len Gilmore and let him take it away.
Okay. I get my okay. Well, as Jessica said, I'm Len Gilmore. I was born and raised in a farm in Bates County, where the Osage Plains from Kansas meet up with the Ozark borders in Missouri there, basically north of the Osage River, kind of in the western part of the state. That's where I kind of cut my teeth. So I know it's known in the Midwest as the border where the border skirmishes occur between the North and the South, but I see this area over in the western part of Missouri as a battle between the prairies of the plains and the trees of the Ozarks. And on the farm, we raised crops, cattle, and hogs. What grasslands we had of pastures were in the upper parts of the farm, and on the lower parts down closer to Deepwater Creek, we had crop fields and trees, some timber there where we cut firewood in the wintertime. But much of the pastures had native prairie that was growing in it, and I didn't know at the time what the prairie was, but later on I learned that many of the grasses were the typical big blue stems and little blue stems. There were some switchgrass and eastern gamma in there, and all these being the native warm season grasses that we have growing on our prairies. But when my dad moved cows from one pasture into another, those cows would always go to the clumps of eastern gamma grass and eat them first. Dad just called them wild grasses. He didn't know what they were. He just called them wild grasses. But the pastures had several of the introduced cool season in them as well. We had the red top and the typical Timothy red top orchard grass, and did have Kentucky bluegrass in them at the time. But when I looked at these pastures recently, they are primarily tall fescue now, but they still have some of these wild grasses hanging on. And so today I'm going to talk a little bit about the value of these wild grasses, or native forages, as we call them, in the grazing and hay systems on farms. So native forages are the original grasses and broadleaf plants that grew on the prairies. The prairies typically had over 200 different kinds of plants that grew across the landscape at that time.
Lynn,
But native, go
sorry,
ahead.
I hate to interrupt you. Are you sharing your screen? We're not seeing your presentation.
Oh, you're not seeing the screen. Oh my, let me get back. I thought I hit share screen. Let me get back to that and make sure. Okay, sorry about that. I wasn't into the meat of things yet.
Oh, no problem. That's what I
Do you
was.
see my screen now? No?
Oh,
Oh, well, let me take this off. Let me go back one more time here. Let's see. Oh, let me see if this helps. Do you see it now? Still not.
yes, I can see it. It's if you have just put it in presentation mode. There you go.
Okay.
Perfect.
Okay. Very good. Well, we're talking about let me go back up one. The native forages were the original grasses. And so as we move on talking about native forages here, we come to the native cool seasons and warm seasons as well. The cool season grasses that are shown here is the wild rye, both Canada and Virginia wild rye, river oats, as well as June grass that we find on prairies. Those are all cool season type of native forages. But then as we get into our warm season grasses that's just listed here that I show, a clump of little blue stem, as well as big blue stem, being one of the more common, or probably the poster child of the prairies is big blue stem. We also have Indian grass, the latest of our native warm season grasses that mature in our prairies, as well as eastern gamma grass, which is one of the earliest maturing of our native warm season grasses that we find here on our prairies and clear down into the Ozarks as well. But eastern gamma grass, of course, likes a little wetter feet than say the little blue stem, which likes a thinner, drier type soils. So it just depends on sites of what or which one of these native warm season grasses will fit best into each of our pasture situations. But the eastern gamma grass, as I said earlier, was the one that the cows went to first and ate. So cool season and warm season grasses have distinct differences in their growth, as well as how they handle moisture as well. Cool season grasses, of course, do most of the growing in the spring and then in the fall as well, depending on which type of grass it is. But noticing that the warm season grasses do the bulk of their growth, of course, in the mid of the summer or the hot, dry time of the year. They start their growth generally toward the end of April there, and we'll kind of conclude it whenever frost comes as we get on into October. It seems like frost gets later and later every year now. But native warm season grasses will keep the level of forage production pretty up high during the summertime when this cool season grasses are at some of their lowest production points. It sometimes mentions that native forbs, and we've heard this before, or the broadleaf plants that we call them, native broadleaves, are used only by wildlife, but actually forbs are palatable for livestock. Many of the forbs are native legumes, such as the prairie clovers or the lespedezas and lead plant. Some of these are more palatable than others, but all grow well with the other grasses. Cattle will browse on the forbs and add them to their diet. And understand that cattle don't eat these legumes, native legumes, the same as what they do introduced legumes like clover and the lespedezas that we have, they just basically browse on them. They'll go along and just clip them off and eat and nibble on them as they go. I've got one producer in Missouri that believe the Forbs provide mineral for cattle. He grazes both fescue and native warm season grasses on his farm. And he also has native Forbs mixed in with the native warm season grasses. But he was telling he provides, salt and minerals to stalker cattle, and that's all he runs is stalker cattle in all of his pastures. He has mineral to them, but he found that the cattle consumed 4 times more mineral in the fescue pastures than the introduced cool season pastures than in the native warm season forage. And he believes that the native Forbs have something to do with the lower mineral consumption that they have in the native warm season grasses. There's an obvious difference looking at illustration here of the roots. There's an obvious difference between native warm season grasses and with Forbs as well versus the cool season grass when you look underground at the root system. Cool season grasses have shorter roots, such as the very shortest is Kentucky bluegrass. Roots do not go down very far in the ground, less than a foot in most cases. But there is one native cool season grass, the June grass that I mentioned earlier. It has longer roots that will go down maybe a couple feet, but you notice those roots, excuse me, on the native cool season are also fairly short compared to a lot of the other native warm season type forages. Native warm season grass roots are much more massive, making the plant able to be efficient with water consumption. In other words, they're able to hold on to more water that plant needs when the time comes that things are dry. They're able to get along through the dry period better. But the native Forb roots, you can see like compass plant, those roots will go down to as much as 15 feet, where a lot of the Indian grass and big blue stem will get down to around 9 to 10 feet. But it's known that some of these Forb roots that are longer seem to pull up nutrients that are shared with the native warm season grass root system. So having both Forbs and the broadleaf plants and the grasses together in the same planting, they tend to do better. At least the grasses will produce better having those Forbs in there as well. And part of that reason we believe is because the nutrients that are pulled up and shared with the native warm season grass roots from the Forbs makes that happen. So the main point here is that native grasses and Forbs do not compete with one another and grow well together. There are some states that still have active programs where they actually spray their prairies to get rid of these weeds. But we're finding that these Forbs, which many call weeds, will do and enhance the native warm season grasses in their productions. This illustration I borrowed from Drexel Atkinson, who is a Southwest Missouri's NRCS soil health specialist, to show another difference between the cool season grass roots and the warm season roots. If you look at the illustration on the right, there's just a real fine hair-like strands that you see here that native warm season grass roots have an additional feature that attaches with them called mycorrhizal fungi. These hair-like strands can help the roots gather moisture and as well as nutrients from further away from the warm season grass roots, and then pulls them in so that the warm season grass roots can utilize those nutrients and the moisture as well. It's like having extensions added to your roots. My hair is getting to where I have to have extensions on it anymore, but with these native warm season grass roots, they have the luxury of having the mycorrhizal fungi attached with them that helps them produce better. But if you notice, the cool season grasses do not have this mycorrhizal fungi that's attached to them. And so their production is affected by that. And then there's many other features that cool season and warm seasons have, that's difference between the two, but we're not going to get into all of those here today. We're going to move on so we can get through the bulk of this. And I don't know what I hit there, but my little thing just went small. Do you see my screen, Jessica?
Yes, it looks like you're back on a website and you're off of your presentation. Yeah.
Okay. So if I pull.
Right. That should, there you go.
That's interesting. Okay. Sorry about that. Hope everybody was able to get a drink through all that. So looking on, let's talk a little bit about the graze and the haying of native forages as we go through this. In recent years, I've seen more and more producers add native forages onto their grazing and haying systems. And it's just a simple way to make your farming operation more with forages more efficient. Particularly as we see weather swings from being wet weather to dry weather. And when it gets dry, boy, it gets dry. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that. As we remember, the last time we were so dry was in, I believe it was 2018, at least here in Southwest Missouri, we were, and it was extremely dry at that time. But adding native forages into your grazing and haying systems can make your farming operation more efficient. And looking at just setting up a grazing system, typical layout, we always take into account, first of all, livestock water that's needed, where it's located, and what the cattle are going to need, particularly for water during the summer, when the native forages are being grazed, because that's when we do most of the grazing of native forages, is during that summer period of time. Native forages and pastures should be rotationally grazed with multiple paddocks or other pastures that they can get to, so you can rotate cattle throughout the summer from pasture to pasture, giving those pastures or paddocks that do not have cattle in them at the time a time to rest and not be grazed, so those forages are not grazed too low, because these native warm season grasses do not do well when they are continuously throughout the year grazed down to the ground. Stocking rate of your livestock has a lot to do with how long that each of these pastures or paddocks will be grazed. So patchburn grazing is a type of grazing that you may or may not have heard about. It works well with native warm season type of forages. It's a type of grazing that depends on and should depend on the size of the native pasture. It's well. Patchburn grazing works better when you have pastures that are 160 acres or larger in size. But the basic premise of patchburn grazing is there is just a fence around the perimeter of the pasture. There is no cross fences in the middle part of it. And with that, we see that in this example, the dotted lines are actually fire breaks that are established within the pasture. And you can maintain those fire breaks from year to year. That basically breaks this pasture up into three pieces, if you want to call it that, or three paddocks, if other people may rather have that term used. But fire is necessary for patchburn grazing. One piece is burned, and in this illustration here, this particular piece here was burned. The other two parts of the pasture, pieces of the pasture, were not burned. on that given year. But what we have found that cattle, even though they have access to the whole pasture, will spend 60% of their time grazing within the burned unit of that pasture. Why? I think as much of anything is because of the small, attractive, lush grass that is growing in that burn unit. So then the next year you rotate that and you burn one of the other two units that were left unburned the year before. So you rotate that through. After that next year, you go to the third patch that was unburned and burn it. And those cattle will change their grazing habits within that pasture unit according to where that burn is at for that given year. This is a Patchburn grazed pasture, one that I had cattle on several years ago. You can tell in the foreground, and this on the right of the slide was the patch burn. That is the patch that was burned in the spring. Stalker cattle went on to this, and you can see most of these calves are spending their time are actually going into the burn patch, even though they have access to the other parts of the pasture that were not burned. And they'll go into that part that was not burned and fill the rumen or and will do some grazing in there as well. But the majority of their grazing will be from the burn patch itself. So looking at this, they'll spend most of their time in the burn patch. But the interesting thing is those calves will still have a high rate of gain through the grazing season, even though they're grazing on a smaller portion of that pasture. Doesn't make sense, but it does keep their gain will still, average daily gain will still remain high within that. Native forages are probably best used in grazing during the summer when the warm season grasses are at their peak growth. Grazing can begin in May and continue to August or September, depending on the stocking rate of the livestock you have. The rule of thumb is to graze half the forage height and leave half of it. In other words, don't take everything off of this. And that is kind of different from what you hear from management intensive grazing, for instance, where they want to keep everything grazed down short so it's uniform. As you can see in this picture here, there's a lot of variation in height amongst the forage within this one paddock itself. But they then rotate the livestock to another pasture and allow the previous pasture to rest and grow back. The leaf stems or leaf length will continue to grow. If your pasture is in a cost share program, I'll just tell you right now, there's a difference in, or there may be even restrictions of when grazing is allowed to go on to the native warm season grass pastures. So you need to check on that before setting up your pasture to do this type of grazing. When comparing the protein levels of native warm season grass with forage tonnage throughout the summer, you can see why we always tell producers it's best to do your hand during the month of July, because that is when your tonnage is relatively medium to high and you still have protein that is relatively medium to high. As you take a look at this, note that the protein levels at the beginning of the grazing season there in May is at their highest. As the summer progresses, the protein levels continue to drop off throughout the whole summer. But as in the reverse of that, obviously your tonnage, the amount of forage that is available out there, is the lowest at the beginning and is at the highest at the end of the grazing season. So therefore, when we're talking about haying, for instance, we talk about trying to get good quality hay as well as getting some tonnage out of. Obviously, you can get more hay if you hay later in the summer. In my part of the country where I grew up, prairies were always hayed in August around Missouri State Fair time, which is toward the end of August. That was generally why, I don't know, but that's generally when they did their haying for the prairies. And what I believe is they were getting more tonnage, they were getting a less quality of hay because the protein content was lower at that time. But that's when they did the haying up in our part of the country. It's now shifted to where they are doing more of their haying in the month of July and getting much better quality hay at that. So now let's take a look. I'm just going to use an 80-acre farm example here from a producer that developed his grazing system. He bought this 80 acres and then developed it for grazing, and entirely just doing grazing on it. And so we're going to find out that he was able to increase his stocking rate during this time of developing his grazing within this 80 acres. Now, understand the only fence that's here is around the perimeter. That's the yellow line. And then the fence around the homestead and around this lot to the north of the homestead. That's the only fence that's on this. The rest of it is pretty all connected together. So the remaining pasture that was on this 80 acres was divided up into paddocks, to several paddocks that you see here. And then water lines were laid and waters were put in so that water was available in each one of these pastures that you see here. Typical setup that people do for a grazing system on their farm. Tall fescue was already growing over the whole farm. And so every bit of it is tall fescue. When he bought this, he went in and had to top dress the fescue. It was pretty run down, let's just say that. So he did quite a bit of fertilizing, top dressing of the fescue to get it to produce, to kind of get it back up into shape. So he spent some time getting his fescue to produce more. And then he come to learn about native warm season grasses. So I'm going to change from an aerial view of the 80 acres and just go kind of to an illustration here so we can see better of what he did on this property. If you want to look here, it's still all into fescue at this point. Then along about 2016, he decided to convert a couple of these paddocks that was in fescue over into native warm season grass. And in fact, that is what he did here. He went in, renovated, killed out the fescue, and planted or drilled in. And at that time, I believe he just drilled switchgrass. It was not a mixture of native warm season grass. It was just switchgrass. It was one species. And I remember looking at it. He'd used a lowland switchgrass. I don't remember if it was Canlow or the other one, but he went in and got the switchgrass established. The interesting thing was he always tells the story. Part of this north paddock up here had some real rough ground in it, and he decided to till it to try to get it smoothed down. And when he tilled it, it came back into dog hair thick foxtail. So it kind of bit him in the hind end, but he always said he learned from that tillage means more weeds. And I bring that up because a lot of times we want to till ground up. We're believing that we would get better soil to seed contact, but sometimes we get just more weeds out of it. But he did get a stand of switchgrass over both of these pastures. Then in 2017, he converted another paddock that laid right next to that into native warm season grasses. He got a good stand of native grasses in that pasture, and it was a mixture of big blue, little blue, and Indian grass. And part of that, I think, was because of the recipe used for herbicides to use with the mazapic in it to kill out and control the fescue within that stand, and helped him get a better stand of native warm season grasses in there. Like I said, it was big blue, little blue, and Indian grass because they were tolerant or are tolerant of the mazapic in that. So it leaves us now with a farm that has both the cool season and warm season grass in the grazing system. So throughout the summer or throughout the year, he can graze his fescue during the spring and fall. And if he stockpiles fescue, he can graze it up into the winter. During the summer, he will graze his native warm season grass portion of this. And looking at this and looking at the percentage, we always tell producers a lot of times we recommend that you convert 25 to 40% of your cool season pasture, if that's all you have is cool season pasture, to convert it over to native warm season grass. But really start out on a small scale, start with small pieces, get comfortable with getting it converted. Don't try to bite off everything all at once. And that's what this producer did, is he kind of did in two hitches here, but he got about 40% of his 80 acres or so converted over to native warm season grasses. Um, the one complaint that he had is it was difficulty in grazing native warm season grasses hard enough to keep them grazed down, because they grew so fast during the summer that he did not have enough cattle. He had to bring in more cattle from another herd to graze the native warm season grasses during the summer. Otherwise, the native warm season grasses outgrew the grazing that the cattle were doing. And that was because of his stocking rate. And just to give you an idea of how well these native grasses will do during the summer. So if we take just a quick look at his 80 acres, he started out with a 15 pair of cow calves on that 80 acres. And then when he got cross fencing put in there and broke it up into smaller paddocks, he was able to increase that up to 25 cow calf pairs. And then as he added in the native warm season grasses, he has bumped that up now to 30 head, 30 cows with the calves, because he's still running that herd with just a cow calf operation there. I'm not sure, he may have even bumped it up higher than the 30, but looking at this, you can just see that he's been able to increase his stocking rate, increase the number of calves that he's able to take off of this 80 acres now by adding in the native warm season grasses, doing the cross fencing and the water, spreading that out, plus doing the adding native warm season grasses into his grazing system has allowed him to be able to increase his stocking rate and the number of head that he's able to graze on that piece of ground. Just taking a quick look at hay, and we know that native grasses make good hay. Hay generally occurs in midsummer, as I mentioned earlier, in the July period, when farm workload is generally less at that time. The weather is drier, which helps the baling of the hay, so it just lends itself better to try to get hay up at that time. The native warm season grasses generally will range from 2 to 4 tons per acre, depending on the field or the type of soil you're dealing with there. But it does not require annual fertilization. Like some of the introduced warm season grasses, such as a Caucasian blue stem or the Bermuda grass. But it's still, you need to do a soil test on it. And if you're haying it, you need to replenish the phosphorus and potash, the P and K within that field, because each bale being hauled off is hauling off nutrients from the field. So those need to be replaced at some point. Run the soil test and see where you're at on that. But the other thing is, I recommend only cut hay once during the summer. do not cut it twice, as some people will do, or some people say, well, you can get by doing that. But it causes native grasses to use root reserves more for new growth, particularly later in the summer. The grasses use root reserves to make new growth. And when the following spring comes, that's when they get their initial growth, is from the root reserves. So if the root reserves are low because of the way it was maybe hayed twice the year before, then the hay tonnage that next year will, in a lot of times, be lower. And I've heard this time and time again from producers. And you'll ask them and they'll say, yeah, I made a lot of growth that previous year. I went out there and did a second cutting of hay. And so basically what they're doing is they're borrowing from the next year's tonnage production on their native warm season grasses when they do that. Here, about 4 years ago, I do recall we had a lot of haying that was done in July on the native warm season grasses. And then along August came some wet weather, and it made a tremendous growth. And when September come around, we had producers that could not stand seeing that much growth out there without going out and haying it again. Well, like I said earlier, they're basically borrowing from next year's production when they go out there and hay later in the year. And we'll talk a little more about that as we get further along in this talk. So now let's go and take a look at some of the benefits that native forages provide in your hay and grazing systems within your farm. First, most of the native forages are perennial plants, meaning that when you plant them and get them established, you don't have to go in and replant them again. You can just manage them properly and they'll stay there for you. Native warm season forages require lower amounts of rainfall compared to the cool season grasses. And generally in our part of the country, the spring of the years when we get most of our rainfall, therefore the cool season grasses do well. But boy, when we get up into the summer and the water spigot turns off, then things change. And we see where the cool season grasses, particularly tall fescue, becomes semi-dormant during the summer. And we'll see here in a minute that even sometimes it will just turn brown during the summer if it gets hot and dry enough. But even during that semi-dormancy of tall fescue in the summer, we find that it will still use 3 times more water than the warm season grass does. And the warm season grass is actively growing during that time, during that same period. So native forages do not, they just don't require as much moisture as what the cool seasons do. And as I mentioned earlier, native forages do not require fertilizer to maintain production on that particular stand. Proper grazing is necessary to improve the function of the soil on the prairies and the native warm season grasses. For them to function properly, you need to have proper grazing, proper stalking rates, and proper rotation with that. But it has to do with the potential to improve and even build soils if the native warm season grasses are not grazed too short and adequate ground cover is maintained. What happens above ground affects what happens below ground. Native root systems, they're massive, as I mentioned earlier. To kind of think about this, so if there's 2 tons of vegetation growing above the ground, then there will be as much as 5 tons of root mass below the ground. It's just they just have such massive root systems, and that's part of the reason why they can withstand drought periods. Plus the root lengths that they go down so far. So this is why the soils under native forages can build such things as organic matter quicker than they can under other vegetation. It's all has to do with proper soil health, and native warm season grasses work well in trying to maintain good soil health. Cattle that graze native forages, they show good gains during the hot summers when cool season grass is shut down during the hot, dry conditions. Stalker cattle, in many of the situations I've been involved with, were weighed on and off the prairie pastures so they could record the weight gains on, in this system. It was a Patchburn Grazing system. Average daily gain showed a little over 2 pounds. That's average, which is pretty good for the summertime, particularly during that time. You will not get that sort of gain. You'll at least be seeing about a pound average daily gain difference between the cool season grass, which will be a pound less than what you will get on native warm season grasses. So if you are running stalkers out there, and trying to get them to produce on the native warm season grasses or the fescue, you're going to see a difference there between the two and the average daily gain. If you have native warm season grasses, you're going to be able to gain at least a pound more per day on those animals. On another farm that I worked with, a producer had converted most of the pastures to native forages and recorded the average daily gain on stalker cattle throughout the summer there as well. And it corresponds with the forage quality and the crude protein that comes along. You remember the crude protein is the highest early in the grazing season, and you'll see in this illustration here on these charts here in May and June, he recorded 3 to 4 pound gains during May and June. As July and August come along, it went down to 2 to 1.5. So it was between 1.5 and 2 pounds of gain during those. But if you take the whole grazing season as a whole, he averaged between 1.7 and 2.8 pounds per head per day from May through August. And in dry, hot conditions, that's not too bad. If you average that out, it is going to be right around 2 pounds of gain per day. And even looking at some of his other data he had collected, here again, early in the grazing season, 3.4 pounds of average daily gain. Back in June there, to as you get into July, it drops down into the 2s, 2 pounds, between 2 and 3 pounds of average daily gain. And as you go further on into August and even into September, which he rarely does, but that gains will drop down into the upper, just below 2 pounds of average daily gain. So get on the native warm season grasses early in the grazing season and utilize that period of time to get your best gains on your stalker cattle. So if you take a look at cows with spring calves, we know that the cow may not show weight gains, even though her body condition will improve. She will milk better a lot of times on native warm season grasses, but that calf will typically gain an additional 60 to 80 pounds over the summer compared to cool season grass such as tall fescue. And I've had several producers tell me this because they have a cow herd at home that is on tall fescue, and they have a cow herd that's up on one of the prairies and grazing the native warm seasons. Typically, they'll tell me that their calves on the native warm seasons will gain an additional 60 to 80 pounds over the calves that are on fescue during that same period of time. So when I had one farmer that attended a pasture walk during 2018, during that drought, I know he asked, well, how much does it cost to plant this native grass seed? And the guy that was hosting the pasture walk said that he had spent $160 an acre on the grass seed. And so the first farmer that asked the question says, well, I just can't afford that. And I got to thinking about that, and it's like, well, the native warm season grasses do not cost more to establish, and if you think about how much additional gain and weight you're going to get in this instance off the calves, if each calf is going to gain an additional 60 to 80 pounds more than what you would on fescue, it won't take him long to recoup his additional cost to plant that native warm season grass compared to planting fescue. So it's just however you put that into perspective, you can recover the added cost of your seed in probably a 3 to 4 year period. And you only have to plant it once. And we know fescue is a perennial grass as well. But so many times there are parts of the pasture that gets thin and they have to add grass back or grass seed back into those places. Cows on tall fescue and in Southwest Missouri generally, they'll drop their calves, spring calves, during February and the very first part of March. Conception rates we find on fescue drop off late in the spring or even in early summer because of fescue toxicosis. Therefore, much of the breeding for spring calves is completed by mid-May. When cows are pasturing native warm season grass forages, though, we see that they can maintain a higher conception rate if you go and breed in June and July for calves that will truly be born as spring calves during April. But most spring calves are being born earlier than that. Late, it's more like a late winter time period. For cows carrying fall calves, we see that they maintain a better body condition, even though they don't need a lot of inputs during that part of their gestation. They still maintain a better body condition when they graze native warm season grasses during the summer. So during the summer of 2018, Southwest Missouri, as I said, experienced that drought, and most of the tall fescue pastures stopped growing and even turned brown, like you see on the photo on the left, and the grass just simply went dormant. During the same period, though, we saw the native warm season grasses remain green and continue growing. And that summer, many producers attended what we had for field tours to see how well the native warm season grasses grew during the drought. And at one evening field tour, we had 50 farmers that rode on wagons back through tall grass or tall fescue pastures that were just simply brown, and they could not believe how green the big blue stem Indian grass and little blue stem pastures were during that period of time. And as a result, most of them had questions on how hard was it to get this planted and to get it seeded, because they saw how well the native warm season grasses were able to grow through that period of time. So native forages generally yield 2 to 4 tons of forage per acre during the middle of the summer, but the yields can be as high as 5 to 6 tons, and in some rare cases even more than that. But they can, personally, I've seen 5 to 6 tons come off of native warm season grass plantings for hay, partly because it was on better ground. So a lot of it makes a difference on what soils you got going on underneath there. But the yield is pretty decent for hay, and the quality of hay is pretty good as well. So I want to spend just a little time talking about how to establish native forages and what the three P's stand for that we're going to talk about. And these 3 P's that we're going to talk about are needed for a successful stand of native forages. There are a couple of misconceptions and misunderstandings about establishing and managing native forages. One of them that I've heard is, well, native grasses are hard to establish. It's just hard to get them planted and established. And I've been planting native forages since 1980 throughout Missouri, and have had very few failures from that. There are much better techniques now, and what you that we just generally use with broadcasting and drilling native grasses, as well as Forbs seeds mixed in with them. The other common belief that is discussed is, well, native grasses will die out easily, meaning it's just hard to keep them going. And they're not, as long as you understand how to manage them. They're no harder than any of the other grasses. It's just a matter of understanding how to take care of them and maintain them. The first P that I want to talk about is preparation. So preparation of the field for planting native seed. Forage seed is key to successful establishment. If the ground is tilled and the soil needs to be rolled or cultipacked to make a firm seed bed, the firm seed bed is very, very important. Make sure that it is firm and not loose. I've planted native grasses since back when, and had much better success establishing them into a firm seed bed versus a fluffy seed bed. You don't want your feet to sink down in the soil. You want it to be a firm seed bed. So do what you need to do to get a firm seed bed with that. There are various recipes for killing out existing vegetation, such as tall fescue or any of the others, but to try to get native forages established. This is just one recipe. This will work well using glyphosate and low levels of mazopic mixed together to get big blue stem Indian grass and little blue stem planted. There are some Forbs or broadleaf plants, natives, that will tolerate this as well. But it actually speeds up the establishment by 1 year, meaning if you have a 1-year-old planting, it looks like a 2-year-old planting. The second P is the planting itself, to determine whether you're going to broadcast it or drill it. My biggest take home here is, do not get the seed in too deep. If you're broadcasting, that's not a problem, but drilling it with many of these no-till drills that soil and water districts have now, it is very easy to get that seed down too deep. Got to set that drill to where it's leaving that seed a 1/4 inch or less. I like to see at least a 1/4 to as much of a 1/3 of the seed exposed. In other words, you can see it within the drill furrows. And that seems to work well. When you get some moisture, it will sprout and do quite well. The third P in establishment is patience, and this is the hardest one of all for the landowners to deal with. Let the planting go, let it do its thing. Just make sure that if weeds come up in there, you clip them off when they get to be a foot high, and clip off high enough that you're not clipping off the seedlings of the native warm seasons as well. But we need to get sunlight to those seedlings for that first year. Few principles to remember when managing as we wrap this up here. Native forages, in managing them, it's important to maintain adequate height of your native forages during grazing. The leaf surfaces are actually little solar collectors, and they recharge the batteries of the roots. So if you take that down more, you have less solar collector to put nutrients into the roots. So several pastures need to be rotated in your grazing if you can do that. And there needs to be a rest period during the grazing season as well, so these grasses can grow back. If you're haying, make sure you hay at all possible. Cut the hay at least 4 inches, no lower than 4 inches above the ground, so that the regrowth can recover quicker. Native warm season grasses need to replenish the root reserves late in the growing season. So remember the 8-45 rule. You should never cut or graze native warm season forages below 8 inches within 45 days of frost, because that's when the growing season is over for the native grasses. the warm season grasses are actively restoring nutrients back in the root system, and you need to allow them to do that. So get off of it early enough, at least by middle of September, and let those grasses recover before frost gets there. The question always comes up, do we need to burn it? Does native warm season grasses need to be burned? Well, we know that the native forages, including the grasses and the forbs, are adapted to burning, but you do not have to burn them. But fire can help control tree sprouts that may be in the pasture. And when the forages are burned at the right time, we do know from studies that the average daily gain on stocker cattle will increase by 10 to 12%. So if you burn that off, you can expect an additional 10 to 12% increase in your average daily gain. And that's nothing to sneeze at. That probably gives you a pretty good incentive, if you can, to burn your native grasses from time to time. And I talked about patchburn grazing earlier. Obviously, fire is an important part for patchburn grazing to work correctly. Well, I think I've spent probably more time than you needed here this evening, but I appreciate the opportunity to talk with you. And at the end of the day, it is always good to see a bob white sitting on a fence post. I enjoyed sharing my experiences with you all, and I've always said that I've lived my experiences through trial and error. If something didn't work, I learned from it and I tried again. And I've worked years with the prairie and the native forages, and enjoy seeing now these native forages being brought back to the farm. So, Jessica, with that, I just thank the folks for spending the time with us this evening here. Any questions?
Great. Yeah, thank you so much for that, Lynn. That was very informative. I enjoyed that presentation very much. Right now, I'm not seeing any questions in the chat box, but if anybody has any questions, feel free to type them in the chat box, or feel free to unmute yourself and ask in person.
And Jessica, is that something folks that have attended, they can Facebook you questions and that sort of thing, and you can get those to me or Ryan, either one of us later,
Yes.
And we can get an answer back to them? That would work as well.
I will type my email into the chat box for anybody that has any questions afterwards. Feel free to email me and I can forward those questions on to Lynn and Ryan, and we'll get them answered for you. Or if you're interested in establishing native grazing, as Lynn mentioned earlier, there are several cost share opportunities through both federal funds and state funding as well for folks interested in maybe getting some native, some forage on your property for grazing purposes. So you can also feel free to reach out to me if you have any interest in any of those programs, and we can get you in contact with a biologist in your area to help get that process going.
Very
Jessica,
good. And go ahead.
Jessica, I had typed in one, but I'm not very good at this stuff. So I had a question. I had a question for him. Very early, you said, I thought you said something about cool season natives. Did you say something about cool season natives?
I did. There are cool season natives, and typically now we're seeing mixtures put together with just not only native warm season grasses, but also mixing in, and generally it's the wild rye. So the Canada and Virginia wild rye are native cool seasons that can go right in the mixture and be established all together. We used to think we had to keep those separate, and we do not. But we do see the difference between native cool season grasses and introduced cool season grasses versus the native warm season. Yes, yeah, and part of the problem is being able to supply or find enough seed to put in, but the wild rye are becoming more and more popular to put into a forage mixture now, along with the native warm seasons as well. and then throwing Forbs on top of that. My goodness, early years, we used to have just one species. And a lot of times it was just switchgrass, because switchgrass seed could go through a conventional drill. It could go through a broadcast seeder much easier than the other fluffy seeds. There are some seed companies out there that will debeard the seed so you can handle it a little bit easier. It just costs more money. But I'll tell you right now, these native forages will pay for themselves. Good question on that, because it's not something we've heard over the years of native cool season grasses. Glad you brought that up.
All right. Are there any questions for, oh, go ahead, Ryan.
Yeah, I had a question about after that frost. You mentioned leave the, let the grasses rest. Yes. 45 days before frost. What about after frost? Can we get any grazing on native warm season grasses through the winter? I know they're dormant.
You can. Depends on how much growth you have there. I do know, and in our part of the country, tall fescue is the primary forage that is being used. The nice thing about tall fescue is you can be stockpiled grazed, so they can stockpile it through the summer, get more set aside, so to speak, of tall fescue that can then be grazed in the fall and up into the winter, to where they do not have to use much hay at all. What I had one producer doing was the native warm season grasses had gone dormant, had quite a bit of growth above ground there, the litter that was there. He turned his cattle into the native warm season for a short period of time. He used electric fences to do that, but for a short period of time, to add, it would be kind of like putting hay into their diet, so to speak, because the native warm season grasses had gone dormant. And it made his cool season, or his fescue, stockpiled fescue, go further in the winter in order to do that. The caution there is, do not graze your native warm season residue down too far. Don't remove it. It still needs to have some coverage for the winter, but you can go in there and graze some of that off. Some call it brown grazing, dormant grazing, whatever you want to call it, but it can be done. Good question, Ryan.
I don't see any questions coming through the chat box. We'll give folks, oh, we have one just came in. Matthew says, on that 80-acre grazing operation, you said he was able to improve his stocking rate from 15 to 30 cow-calf pairs. I assume that was the summer stocking rate. Any indication on how much hay he was able to cut or use to overwinter?
He did not cut any hay off of that 80 acres. He used it entirely for grazing. And so he was able to graze that herd on the fescue in the spring and in the fall. And in some instances, he was able to do some stockpile of the fescue, but for the most part, he still had to hay in the wintertime, or feed hay in the wintertime. In fact, he did a little bit of dormant season grazing of the natives that were there. But for the most part, he did not do any cutting of hay on that 80 acres. So he was able to increase, mainly because he went into a rotational type grazing and added better forage for the summer, which was the native warm seasons forages. I don't know if that answered all of that, but I think I knew what they were getting at there.
Yes, he said thank you. Enjoy.
Okay, good.
If there are no other, we have a question from Ben. He said, for winter grazing on native warm season grasses, what would be the threshold of being grazed too low? Should there be left similar to in the summer months, or should they be less similar to in the summer?
It will be similar to some extent. I mean, if you get off of them early enough, late in the summer, and they make quite a bit of growth before frost, and that's when they shut down, then you're going to be able to do some brown grazing or dormant grazing on them. I would still look at not going below that 8 inches in height. So if you look out there and you say, well, and they're going to trample some of that down too, just use your judgment on it. But it's better to be safe than to take too much of it all. But I'd look at that 8-inch range.
Okay, well, we'll give a couple more minutes for people to get any last minute questions in there. And while we wait for that, again, I just do want to mention to everybody that on the 17th of this month, May 17th from 6 to 7, we will be having our second session in our native grazing webinar series. And for that one, we're going to have Ryan Parker, who's on the call with us, or on the webinar with us today. And he is going to be going over a little bit more of the wildlife benefits of native grazing and how those two can kind of go hand in hand, and some other good information on native grazing. So if you're interested in that, make sure you keep an eye out for that link to register for that event as well. And the field tours, if you're anywhere near the Marshall, Arkansas area or the Boonville, Arkansas area, again, we're going to have those in-person field tours at the end of this month as well. So I'm not seeing any more questions come through, so I guess we'll go ahead and let everybody go. I will stop the recording. And again, thank you all for joining us. I hope you enjoyed this presentation and learned as much from Lynn as you can. I know that I have learned so much from him over the past couple of years. So thank you all, and hopefully we'll see you soon.
Thank you.
Thanks, Jessica.